Chapter 10, Lesson 3, Problems with Foreign Powers. Main idea: Jefferson tried to avoid involvement in the problems of other nations. One American story. In 1804, the United States was at war with Tripoli, a state on the North African coast. The war was the result of repeated attacks on American merchant ships by African pirates. U.S. Navy Lieutenant Stephen Decatur was sent to destroy the U.S. warship Philadelphia, which had been captured by Tripoli, so that it could not be used by the enemy. Decatur set fire to the Philadelphia and then escaped under enemy fire with only one man wounded. Decatur later issued this rallying cry for all Americans. A voice from the past. Our country, in her relationships with foreign nations, may she always be in the right, but our country, right or wrong. Stephen Decatur, 1816. The conflict with Tripoli showed how hard it was for the United States to stay out of foreign affairs while its citizens participated so heavily in overseas trade. In this section, you will learn how President Jefferson handled problems with other nations. Jefferson's foreign policy. When Thomas Jefferson took office in 1801, he wanted to focus on domestic concerns. In his inaugural address, he noted that America was kindly separated by nature and a wide ocean from the exterminating havoc wars of one quarter of the globe. He advised the United States to seek the friendship of all nations, but to enter into entangling alliances with none. However, the President's desire to keep the United States separated from other nations and their problems was doomed to fail. For one thing, American merchants were busily engaged in trade all over the world. For another, the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition were about to open the country to westward expansion. Expansion would bring Americans into closer contact with people from other nations who had already established settlements in the West. Finally, the United States had little control over the actions of foreign nations, as North African interference with the U.S. shipping had shown. Staying out of the ongoing conflict between France and England would be just as difficult. Problems with France and England. For a long time, the United States managed not to get involved in the European wars that followed the French Revolution. At times, the nation even benefited from the conflict. Busy with affairs in Europe, France sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States, and American shippers eagerly took over the trade interrupted by the war. By 1805, however, the British began to clamp down on U.S. shipping. They did not want Americans to provide their enemies with food and supplies. After the United States threatened to take action, the British decided to set up a partial blockade. This would only allow some American ships to bring provisions to Europe. This partial blockade angered France, which enacted its own laws to control foreign shipping. These changes put American merchants in a difficult position. If they obeyed the British rules, their ships could be seized by the French. If they obeyed the French rules, their ships could be seized by the British. Britain also interfered with U.S. trade by the impressment or kidnapping of American sailors to work on British ships. Between 1803 and 1812, the British impressed about 6,000 American sailors. One of the most famous incidents occurred in 1807. The British ship Leopard attacked an American naval ship, the Chesapeake, off the coast of Virginia. 3 Americans lost their lives in the battle. The attack aroused widespread anger. Had Congress been in session, America might have declared war. But Jefferson, who had been re-elected in 1804, decided against it. One critic, furious at the president's caution, called Jefferson a dish of skim milk curdling at the head of our nation. Trade as a weapon. Instead of declaring war, Jefferson asked Congress to pass legislation that would stop all foreign trade. Peaceable coercion, as the president described his policy, would prevent further bloodshed. In December, Congress passed the Embargo Act of 1807. Now American ships were no longer allowed to sail to foreign ports. The act also closed American ports to British ships. Jefferson's policy was more harmful to the United States than to the British and French. American farmers and merchants were especially hard hit. Southern and Western farmers, for example, lost important markets for their grain, cotton, and tobacco. Shippers lost income, and many violated the embargo by making false claims about where they were going. The embargo became a major issue in the election of 1808. Jefferson's old friend James Madison won the election. By the time he took office, Congress had already repealed the embargo. Madison's solution to the problem was a law that allowed merchants to trade with any country except France and Britain. Trade with these countries would start again when they agreed to respect U.S. ships. But this law proved no more effective than the embargo. Tecumseh and Native American unity. British interference with American shipping and oppressment of U.S. citizens made Americans furious. They were also angered by Britain's actions in the Northwest. Many settlers believed that the British were stirring up Native American resistance to frontier settlements. Since the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, Native Americans continued to lose their land. Thousands of white settlers had swarmed into Ohio and then into Indiana. Jefferson's Native American policy promoted what he called civilization, getting Native Americans to farm the land, convert to Christianity, and live as white settlers lived. Instead of having Indian agents take land by force, Jefferson increased the number of trading posts on the frontier. Jefferson hoped Native Americans would buy goods on credit, fall into debt, and sell off lands to repay the debt. Tecumseh, a Shawnee chief, vowed to stop the loss of Native American land. He believed that the reason Native Americans continued to lose their land was because they were separated into many different tribes. He concluded that Native Americans had to do what white Americans had done, unite. Events in 1809 proved him right. That September, William Henry Harrison, governor of the Indiana Territory, signed the Treaty of Fort Wayne with chiefs of the Miami, Delaware, and Potawatomi tribes. They agreed to sell over 3 million acres of land, but Tecumseh declared the treaty meaningless. A voice from the past. Whites have taken upon themselves to say this land belongs to the Miamis, this to the Delawares, and so on. But the Great Spirit intended Native American land to be the common property of all the tribes, and it cannot be sold without the consent of all. Tecumseh, quoted in Tecumseh and the Quest for Indian Leadership. After the Treaty of Fort Wayne, many Native Americans began to answer Tecumseh's call for unity, but his efforts ultimately failed. In November 1811, while Tecumseh was away recruiting tribes for his alliance, the Shawnee were defeated by Harrison's forces at the Battle of Tippecanoe. It was a severe setback for Tecumseh's movement. Warhawks. After the Battle of Tippecanoe, Tecumseh and his warriors found a warm welcome with the British in Canada. At that point, the Native Americans and the British became allies, which raised even higher the anti-British feelings in the West. Leaders such as Congressman Henry Clay of Kentucky angrily demanded war against Britain. Westerners who also called for war were known as Warhawks. They wanted British aid to Native Americans stopped, and they wanted the British out of Canada. Conquering Canada would open a vast new empire for Americans. Other Americans sought war because of the British violations of American rights at sea. Future President Andrew Jackson said hostilities were necessary to protect our maritime citizens impressed on board British ships of war and to open a market for the productions of our soil. Urged by Jackson and the Warhawks, Congress declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. In the next section, you will read about the second and final war between the United States and Great Britain. Causes of the War of 1812. Impressment of U.S. citizens. Interference with American shipping. British support of Native American resistance.